we might know how to pray for one another and support one another. Be with us this morning as we think about the events in Ukraine and give us greater insight into how we can understand how you may be at work. We pray all these things through your Son's name. Amen. Well, last week we began to get some historical introduction to this part of the world, and this morning we're going to focus on the different churches, the different religious groups in Ukraine, and the way that they have been affected and swept up by the conflict. Let's do just a little bit of review to begin with. So we looked last week at our map of Ukraine, and one of the things that I pointed out historically is that Ukraine is known as borderlands. In fact, the very word Ukraine may mean in the Russian language on the edge, on the border. And Ukraine has always been this area between the other great European empires. And so to the south, across the Black Sea, to the south, what was the Ottoman Empire, at one time Asia Minor, before that Byzantium. To the east, that long border with Russia, and so times when Russia has dominated Ukraine, and then to the west, Poland, and at other times the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but Ukraine always in the middle. Ukraine always buffeted by these other great imperial ambitions. And so that has affected Ukraine to this day, that the eastern part, where most of the war is presently taking place, the eastern part has been primarily Russian-speaking and more closely associated and aligned with Russia over the centuries, whereas to the west, the part of Ukraine that was dominated by the Lithuanian, Polish Commonwealth, that part has been more Ukrainian-speaking and with a stronger nationalistic Ukrainian identity. And then the center has gone back and forth, the area around what is now the capital, Kiev. So in between, always being pulled one way or another. And Ukraine did not even become an independent nation. There was no country. There was no nation-state of Ukraine until 1991. So we might think of this as an ancient part of the world, but in terms of actual national independence, national state integrity, Ukraine finally had independence as a nation only with the collapse of the Soviet Union and then the establishment of Ukraine, 1991. So this has also affected, as I said last week, the way that people still tell the story about Ukraine. Russians and Ukrainians together date their birth to what happened in the peninsula of Crimea in 988. You recall we talked about Prince Vladimir, the prince of the Eastern Slavs, and he was baptized, he was received into Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. 988 in Crimea, he returned to his capital in Kiev, and then had his warriors and their families baptized en masse in the Dnieper River that flows through the center of Kiev. And Russians and Ukrainians, both peoples, understand that to be the moment of their birth, what gave them distinctive identity. But they tell the story since 988 very differently. So the Russians say, we've been one people since 988. We all go back to that baptism of Prince Vladimir. We've been together. It's always the West that's trying to divide us into two peoples. That's not the way Ukrainians tell the story. They say, we've always been a separate people. Yes, we share so much with Russians. Yes, we have these common roots. But since 988, Ukraine had its own story, its own history, and often the history of a suffering, martyred people, dominated, as I said, by these different competing European empires. So the way that Ukrainians suffered under the Tatar Mongolian invasion in the 13th century, the way they were dominated by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries. And then with the rise of the Russian Empire under Peter the Great in the early 18th century, Ukraine and Russia were together, first in the Russian Empire and then in the Soviet Union. And nevertheless, Ukrainians say throughout all of that, we have had our own language, our own traditions, our own history. We're not simply Russians. Yes?
Maybe you said this before, but how did that border with Russia get drawn? Like it's so...
Yeah, complicated border. Well, borders are complicated, aren't they? How they get to be. There's no, for the most part, there's no river or natural division there, mountain ranges or anything. So, you know, a lot of this was sort of artificially drawn over the centuries during the time of the Russian Empire, when Russia took over, dominated what is now largely Ukraine and then the Soviet Union. But the borders were, at that point, since they were one country, they were rather artificial, right? I mean, you didn't need a visa to go from Ukraine to Russia or from Russia to Ukraine. The Crimean Peninsula belonged to Ukraine until, or was considered part of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic until the 1950s, when Khrushchev, I'm sorry, it was part of Russia until the 1950s, until Khrushchev said, well, let's make it part of Ukraine, just sort of arbitrarily. So, you know, it could have been drawn differently, and at times over history there were slight differences in that border. But, you know, along that border is sort of wide open plains. There's nothing naturally to separate them. There have been Ukrainians on both sides, Russians on both sides, and so very permeable border until recently. Yeah, borders are complicated. So anyway, two people, one history, two histories. This is part of the backdrop that then, after Ukrainian independence, the Ukrainians increasingly asserting themselves as having their own identity, not being part of Russia, and the growing conflict then, first with the Maidan Revolution in 2014 that deposed a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, led to a more pro-Western policy in Ukraine. This provoked Russia. Russia in 2014, in response to the Maidan, annexed Crimea, said, we're going to take it back. What Khrushchev did in the 1950s doesn't count, and then supported separatists in the Donbass area in this eastern part of Ukraine along the border. So that is the area. The area in red is the disputed area, the area that's been occupied by Russia. The red with the white stripes, Crimea, and parts of the Donbass were already coming under Russian control in 2014 after this Maidan revolution. And then the other areas in red, that is what Russia has occupied since its invasion in February 2022. The little circles indicate where most of the fighting is presently taking place, so you can see it's mostly to the east in that so-called Donbass area that Russia would especially like to, well, claims that it already has annexed, is now part of Russia, but of course Ukraine still lays claim to. All right, so that's the backdrop, and now, as I said this morning, we'll talk a little bit more about how churches get caught up in these conflicts and what this does to Christian witness. So here's the problem that every probably Christian body throughout the world faces. How are you loyal to your country on the one side, and on the other side give witness to the fact that the gospel transcends borders? How can you be both a good American and a good Christian? How can you be both a good Russian and a good Christian, or a good Ukrainian and a good Christian? How do you put together loyalty and love for the country that you were born in, that has nurtured you, at the same time with the Christian gospel that says, in Christ there is no east or west, in him no north or south, but one great fellowship of love. How to put those two things together has always been perplexing to Christians. And there's always been the temptation for the church to become nationalistic and to forget it's called to a universal horizon. And this affects the churches also in Ukraine. So let's take a look. All of the major churches, the Orthodox churches or Orthodox-related churches in Ukraine and Russia, trace themselves back to 988, and this is the mother church in Kiev, the first great Orthodox cathedral in that part of the world, St. Sophia Cathedral. It's been added to and changed over time. This is not how it looked 1,000 years ago, but it's been there for nearly 1,000 years. And out of that birth of Orthodoxy, out of that baptism of Prince Vladimir, as I said, even how you pronounce the name is disputed. Because we say Vladimir, the Russians say Vladimir, and the Ukrainians say Volodymyr. So will the real Vladimir please stand up? Who is he exactly? But out of that baptism, all right, and here's where it starts to get detailed. You didn't invite me to make it easy this morning. So there are three major churches that came out of 988. These are the three major churches in Ukraine today. They account for 2/3 or 3/4 of the population, have some kind of affiliation with these three major churches, and all of them with their roots in 988 and Prince Vladimir. So the first is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It was an Orthodox church, but because of Ukrainian history, I told you that the western part of Ukraine came under the domination of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was Catholic. So at the end of the 16th century, essentially, those churches in the western part of Ukraine were forced to shift their loyalty to Rome. They were allowed to keep their Orthodox customs, their Orthodox vestments of the priests, their calendar, their traditions, but at the end of the 16th century, they became part of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's the case to this day. Ukrainian, Greek, Catholics, Orthodox traditions, but formally they commemorate, they are loyal to now Prince Francis. The second major church in Ukraine today is called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and the acronym UOC, the abbreviation, the initials UOC. Yeah, you're going to see this gets really complicated in a minute, keeping track of them. This was once part of the Russian Orthodox Church, because when Ukraine and Russia were one country, then the Russian Orthodox Church was the official church, sponsored, promoted by the government, accepted by the government, both during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. There was essentially one church for both Russia and Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church. But in 1991, because of Ukrainian independence, this part of the Russian Orthodox Church became increasingly autonomous. And then after the invasion, the invasion was in February 2022, but in May, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church said, we are now fully independent of Moscow. We no longer have any formal loyalty to the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. We are the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. All right, and then the third major body is called the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So, OCU versus, there's the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And that one was a church that broke off, was schismatic right after Ukrainian independence. The ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul, Constantinople, recognized it as an autocephalous church already in 2019. So if you're already confused, this is not to be unexpected. The point is to say there are three major churches coming out of 988, but over time have adopted their own jurisdictional integrity, their own jurisdictional status. Three churches, all saying we go back to 988, but now with these rivalries between them. And we'll say more about this. But the first one, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, strongest in Western Ukraine, the part that was dominated in the Middle Ages by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The second church, that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that used to be part of the Russian Orthodox Church, strongest to the east, the Russian-speaking area, the area close to the Russian border, and then the third church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, is strongest in the center of Ukraine, the part that has always gone sort of back and forth. They are accounting, as I say, for 2/3 or 3/4 of the population, but have now, because of politics, this kind of rivalry, these distinctive identities. All right, well, let's look at some of the personalities involved then. So today, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow is Patriarch Kirill, and he's been a very strong supporter of President Putin, very strong supporter of the war against Ukraine. He's constantly going back to this Russian story. We're one people, we've always been one people, we all go back to 988 AD, we all come out of the same baptism. The West is trying to split us apart. The West is trying to impose its moral values on us. So he has been very pro-Putin, pro-war. And until 2022, this man was Patriarch Kirill's representative in Ukraine, Metropolitan Onufry. But when the Ukrainian Orthodox Church declared we're no longer under the Russian Orthodox Church, then Onufry became head of this new church body called the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. No longer part of Moscow, no longer part of the Moscow Patriarchate. We're our own church in Ukraine. The problem is that the guy who used to be his boss, oops, okay, got carried away here. The guy who used to be his boss, Patriarch Kirill, says, well, you may say you're independent, but I'm saying you're still part of us. So this has put the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in a very awkward position because Kirill does not recognize the steps that Onufry has taken to make this church independent of Moscow. On the other side, the other Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, OCU, which began as a schismatic church, then received autocephaly, a declaration of independence. That was given by this man, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. So again, there are two rival patriarchs at work in Ukraine. Kirill, who says, no, it really ought to be part of Russia, and the Ecumenical Patriarch, who has said, no, Ukraine should have its own Orthodox Church, and that's what he declared in 2019. By the way, I don't know if any of you get the Atlantic magazine, but the latest Atlantic has a story about the clash of the patriarchs. And it's precisely on this topic, the rivalry between Kirill in Moscow and Bartholomew in what is now Istanbul. So he declared in 2019 that there would be an independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and it is now under this man, Metropolitan Epiphanius. Right? The plot thickens with all the players. And then the other church, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, that's been under Rome since the end of the 16th century, of course, is under Pope Francis. And his representative in Ukraine is this man, Archbishop Sevchuk. But as you've looked at the pictures, you've seen that all of the hierarchs in Ukraine they wear the same kind of vestments. You know, you and I wouldn't immediately say, oh, he must be Catholic, or he must be OCU or UOC. Common traditions, common past. I don't know how many of you are lifelong Presbyterians, but Presbyterians manage to split and divide about as quickly as the Orthodox do. So which is the real Presbyterian church? I don't know. Christians have this way of fighting with each other. All right. But in Ukraine, in addition to these three major churches, there are, of course, other smaller church bodies. Evangelical Protestants are only about 2% of the population, but very active. They've been very active in humanitarian work during the war, going out to the countryside, delivering food to villages, to elderly people who've not been able to escape, doing a lot of missionizing, evangelizing in war-torn Ukraine. And in addition, Ukraine has once had a huge Jewish population, much of it eradicated during the Holocaust when the Nazis invaded Ukraine. There are also Muslims. Remember those Tatars from the 14th century who swept across Ukraine and left some of their descendants to this day. So Tatars, especially in Crimea, a sizable population. And then even other Protestant groups, historic Lutherans, some Calvinists. So a pluralistic religious landscape dominated by the three large churches that we've been focusing on. So let's go back to them one more time and see how they relate to the war, where they have put their emphasis, the witness that they want to make to the future of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the one that shares the Orthodox roots with the other two, was very supportive of the popular revolution in 2014 that brought down the pro-Russian president, and then has pushed for Ukraine to adopt Western standards of democracy and rule by law. So more interested in Ukraine being part of the Western world, not because Ukraine wants everything that the West has. Not all Ukrainians tend to be pretty conservative in their moral values, but nevertheless, the Greek Catholic Church has especially emphasized the importance of democracy and law, and not just arbitrary dictatorship. This has been the vision of the Greek Catholic Church for Ukraine. About 10% of the population, as I say, especially in the West. The other two churches that trace back to 988, the UOC and the OCU, represent about 50% of the population there. It's very, very difficult under the conditions of war to know exactly what percentage of Ukrainians associate with which of these two rival churches. Many Ukrainians couldn't even tell you the difference. They just go to church. They couldn't tell you, is Swickley Peace USA or PCA or OPC or EPC? Well, I just go to church. I don't know, ask your pastor what we are. I just love going to church here. Well, that's the way many Ukrainians think about it. They don't know about all of these jurisdictional battles. So it's a little bit hard to know. In general, people have, because of the war, we'll talk more about this, the UOC that has those Russian roots is seen somewhat more suspiciously, and so perhaps more people have been drifting over to the Ukrainian, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So, as I say there, the OCU, that got its independence through Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew in 2019, thinks of itself as a nationalistic Ukrainian church. We want to be Ukraine's national church. We want to be the recognized church in Ukraine. If you think a little bit like the Anglican Church, the Church of England in England, or the Lutheran Church in Sweden, these are sort of semi-national state churches. Well, that's the kind of vision that the OCU has for its role in the future of Ukraine. Whereas the other church, the one that until 2022 was under the Russian Orthodox Church, tries to play this more middle stance. We are a Ukrainian church, but we want to have good ties with Russia. We share these common roots. So 3 churches with 3 different visions of what the future of Ukraine should be all about. Well, finally, let me focus on the dilemma of that church in between, the borderlands church in the borderlands, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, to just say a word about how difficult it is to go between to find a middle space, to go between the polarities, to find a way to try to transcend some of the nationalistic fervor that so easily infects also the churches. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, as I said again, this is the one under Onufry, used to be under the Russian Orthodox Church, has now declared its independence, but is seen as having held on to Moscow and the Russian roots to a greater extent than the rival Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So here's an interesting map. In the Orthodox liturgy, when the Orthodox worship on a Sunday morning, part of their prayer is to commemorate their leader, commemorate the head of their church. And so up until May 2022, all of the churches of the UOC would have been commemorating Kirill, the Patriarch in Moscow. Well, already you can see, not even before May, by March, after the Russians had invaded in February, notice that where you see the blue dots, these are churches belonging to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Already in March of 2022 said, we are so upset at what Moscow is doing. We are so upset at what Patriarch Kirill has done to support the war. We're no longer going to pray for him in our liturgy. We will no longer commemorate him. Now, what do you notice about where most of the blue dots are? What part of Ukraine? It's all to the west, right? The part that is less Russian-speaking, more Ukrainian, more influenced historically by the Poles and Lithuanians, where you have a stronger representation of Greek Catholics. It began from the west, this kind of, we've got to speak out against Russia, what Russia is doing to us. And then the green, these are the dioceses that began to commemorate Onufri instead of Kirill after Onufri declared the UOC's full independence from the Russian Orthodox Church in May 2022. So you notice now it drifts further to the east, right? Getting more and more towards the Russian-speaking areas. And then the red, these are areas that today where what used to be Ukrainian Orthodox parishes now still commemorate Kirill. They don't commemorate Onufri, but why is that? Because those are the occupied territories. So if you're a priest and you don't want to lose your neck, and you're under Russian occupation, you're not going to commemorate the Ukrainian church leader, you commemorate the Russian church leader, Kirill. And then one other area that is about half and half occupied with the yellow-orange circle. That, by the way, is where that nuclear reactor is, Zaporozhye. So that area, the local bishop can't make up his mind. So he commemorates both of them, both Kirill and Onufri. But you can see, what a complicated picture it is figuring out these loyalties.
Is an added complication we've experienced in the Presbyterian Church, and the Episcopal Church experienced it, Presbyterians in the 30s experienced it, the assets, the actual who owns these beautiful church buildings, is that also part of the problem?
Okay, yes. So you had to make it more complicated. Thank you. I thought I already was losing my audience. It doesn't affect the typical parish so much, but the great churches and the great monasteries. And I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment. But St. Sophia in Kiev is actually owned by the government. It was confiscated during the Soviet era, and after the fall of communism, never returned. In part because there were these rival churches in Ukraine. So the government said, well, we're not going to give it to any of you. The largest monasteries in Ukraine are all leased to the church. They're not owned by the church. And in some cases, as we'll see, the government has canceled a lease to the UOC in order to give it to the other Orthodox group, the OCU. So in that sense, yes, there is some dispute about the property assets. Yes?
I'm bringing it home, the two buildings in Carnegie, the Ukrainian Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, which Ukrainian churches that of, and how are those congregations getting on together these days?
Oh, see, you're going to make it even more complicated now. So in the United States, most of the Ukrainian Orthodox churches for a long time have been under the jurisdiction of this ecumenical patriarch in Istanbul, what used to be Constantinople. So long before this conflict took place, they already were formally under the ecumenical patriarch. The other church in Carnegie, I'm trying to remember, I think is...
It's Russian Orthodox.
I think Russian Orthodox in its roots, but I think that group became independent of Moscow in 1970. and is part of the Orthodox Church in America, but with Russian roots. So yes, these jurisdictional questions get really, really complicated and have this complicated history to them. Yeah. Okay, so you can see anyway, the point of the map is how the anti-Russian sentiment, the anti-Russian Orthodox sentiment started, especially in the West, but as the war proceeded, it has encompassed most of Ukraine, except for those areas occupied by the Russians.
Are there any rebel bishops in these eastern, the red or yellow?
Well, that's about right. In the occupied areas, any of the Greek Catholic priests or the OCU priests have been arrested. Some have simply disappeared for a period of time. Others now have been located, but they've been imprisoned or being put on trial. So, yes, there's this effort to kind of cleanse those occupied areas of any of the rival churches so that they will only be under Patriarch Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. Yeah. All right, again, another picture that gives you statistics that demonstrates the tragic situation that the UOC finds itself in. So these are the provinces in eastern Ukraine, Russian-dominated historically, Russian Orthodox Church for a long time. And you can see the two rival churches, the OCU under the Ecumenical Patriarch and the UOC under Onufry. Well, the one with the historical, that kept the Russian roots longest, the UOC has by far the majority of parishes, sometimes 6, 7 times more than 8 times more than the rival church. But these are also the areas where the UOC increasingly is not able to operate and under Russian occupation are becoming Russian Orthodox churches. Well, finally, as I was alluding to a moment ago, many of the church properties in Ukraine, the major church properties, were never given back to the church. They belonged to the state. And in Kiev, the great historic monastery, the one that dates back as the first monastery, the first monastery out after Prince Vladimir's conversion, this monastery of the caves. Along the banks of the Dnieper River, these beautiful historic churches. And here's an instance where after 1991, after Ukrainian independence, the government leased Monastery of the Caves to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the one strongest in the east, the one that was long associated with Moscow. Leased it. But last year, under increasing pressure, President Zelensky annulled that lease agreement. The monastery grounds were, people were no longer allowed entrance into the monastery grounds. Police, army units with weapons patrolling to eventually remove all the monks who were accused of being pro-Russian. They were removed from the monastery, and eventually it appears that the monastery will now be given for use to the other Orthodox group, the rival group, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. All right, so now that I've shown you how Christians can be, how loving and peaceable and able to work with each other, but I think you also understand a little bit more about this bigger problem. How do Christians figure out their loyalties? Are we are we Ukrainian? But if we're Ukrainian, does that mean we're Western? Or does it mean we're more Russian? Or who are we as Ukrainians? So what is our Christian faith as Ukrainians? And if we all come out of 988, we somehow should be one church, and yet we have these different visions of what our country should be and where our church fits into it. So next week, this is just to say, come back next week as I begin to try to give us some orientation about what the future might bring. But for today, let's see if there are other questions or clarification or comments now that you have some of the background for it. Yes?
When you mentioned commemoration, you said that the Orthodox Church changed the liturgy so that they only prayed for certain patriarchs. Does commemoration mean anything other than how it affects the liturgy?
Well, it's a reflection of what jurisdiction you understand yourself to be under. So if you no longer pray for Kirill, you're saying we're no longer part of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. That's what it reflects. So the liturgical difference reflects a difference in jurisdictional affiliation.
Okay, I understand that, and this is going to sound very naive, but it seems to me Christ told us to pray for our enemies.
Yes.
It seemed to me it might help Ukraine if they prayed for all the churches.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is part of what the next two sessions we'll talk about. How do Christians find a way beyond, see, this is your essay question for the week. Can churches resist the nationalistic temptation? Can they contribute to reconciliation? This is what we want to try to understand in the 2 weeks that we still have. Yes?
I love the history of the Reformation in Europe. Why didn't it go further east? Do you know that background?
Yeah, well, there was something called the Catholic Counter-Reformation.
Right.
Right? So for a time, it could have been different. The Reformation was quite successful in Poland.
Right.
But then the Catholic Church reasserted its theology, its influence, its power. And so Poland ended up pretty much persecuting the Protestants and becoming Catholic again. So it didn't get much, the Reformation really never got further east than Poland, what is now the Czech Republic, Slovakia, just beginnings, intimations of it in what is now Russia. Of course, at that time, it was still the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So, yeah, the Reformation never really impacted the areas that are now Russia and Ukraine.
Is it because the Eastern Orthodox faiths were more bibliocentric? Did they adhere closer to the scriptures than Rome had kind of gotten tradition and all those laws bogged down? Sola Scriptura was one of the cries of the Reformation. Like, were the Easterners like, well, we always were sticking to the Bible? I've not done my research. I find it fascinating.
Yeah. I think I see. Okay, so the question is, why didn't the Reformation take hold of the Orthodox
imagination, even
their imagination,
Yeah.
much that they might have shared with the Protestants? Yeah, I think I just have to come back to a short answer to say, so often church realities have been dictated by politics.
Right.
So the Orthodox churches and what are now Russia and Ukraine were always under the strong national influence of anti-Western empires. And so there was no ability from the ground up to say, oh, let's ignore what the ruler thinks and we'll become Protestant.
Yeah.
That's a very new idea, the idea of religious tolerance or religious freedom. We take it for granted, but this was not the case in the Middle Ages or even up until really the 18th century, that there was this notion, oh, well, I grew up Orthodox, but I could choose to become Protestant. so much was dictated by who was in power. Yes, John?
You mentioned the evangelical church was 2%.
Mhm.
Are there any other Protestant church, what is the Protestant?
You know,
Are there any others?
there were times when, for example, under Catherine the Great invited German immigrants to come settle in places like Ukraine and Russia because she wanted to develop agriculture. And so Mennonites from Germany established themselves. Lutherans from Germany established themselves. So yes, historically there are some other Protestant churches, but for the most part associated with immigrant groups that brought it with them into the country. Well, I think we're at our time, so if you want an answer, maybe you don't want an answer. If you don't want an answer, don't come back next week. But for further reflections, I'd love to see you. Thank you for your participation this morning.